welcome to another Epic Cycles tutorial video. My name is Paul, and in this video we're going to show you how to unbox and assemble a brand new BlueRev TRIO. So here we go. First we're going to need a cutting knife just to get through the straps. So on the box, on these two boxes that you get, you will have some assembly or packaging straps. We will cut them away. And we could pull the box open. In the box that I'm opening now, we'll have the front of the frame of your new TRIO E-TRIKE. In the box you'll have a parts kit. We'll put that aside for the moment. We'll get to that later. The second part will have your frame. So this is what it'll look like when it comes out of the box. Just going to push the box aside. And the next box is what's going to hold the rear triangle of your tricycle. Cut away the straps. And just pull the box open like the other one. And in here, we'll have the rear end of the bike, as well as a few other parts. So for the moment, we can put it on the box. And finally, we can start undressing or unwrapping the bicycles. I'm going to start with removing the basket. That's this large section here. We'll just cut away the straps with a side cutter. And there's our basket kit, which I'll just put aside for the moment. Remove all the packaging from the bike. That will take care of the rear triangle. I'll move the box again for some space. And on this side, we're going to use the cutters once again. And there's numerous zip ties to undo. Doesn't matter what order you take these apart. In this case, I will start with the wheel, which also houses the motor. This will be your seat. It'll be one of the last things we install, but we'll just unwrap it anyways. And there we go. And we have lots of packaging to remove. Bicycles are very well packaged. That will keep your bicycle in great shape during the delivery and protect it from any damage that might happen along the way. In here we will find our brakes. I'm just going to very carefully put them aside. So this is your left and right rear brake. And you'll find that the unpackaging or the unboxing of this will take you a little while, as everything's so well wrapped and so well protected. And you might even find a knife to come in handy. Be careful not to cut too deep, as you don't want to cut into the paint job and scratch your bicycle. So in this video, we're going to try to keep this as simple as possible, using the minimal amount of tools, things that you should hopefully have at home. You might find this handy as well to steady the bicycle. I'm just going to put it under the rear triangle here. That'll sort of help support the bike, make it a little bit easier for you. And that will be the beginning of unwrapping. So we're going to clean up this and we're going to move to the next stage in just a moment. I always recommend to keep a clean workplace. In case you drop anything, you won't find it mixing up with your garbage or anything else that's laying on the floor. So that's our bike. We got the front triangle, we got the rear end of the bike, we have the front motor wheel, And of course we have the basket and the parts kit. So in the parts kit, I'm going to open that now, and we'll be able to take our way, go through all the parts that come with it. Right, so in this little box that's marked toolkit, it will be housing most of the parts that you'll need to finish the assembly of the bicycle. Now, start with just cutting your box open. And in the box, you'll see right away, we have our pedal kit. We'll have our light, parts for the fenders. It will come with a factory toolkit, most of which will be useful for this job. Very important, do not lose any of your little screws that come in these 2 packages here, possibly 3 packages. That will be for the fender as well. It will offer you a bunch of zip ties so you can tie down cables. Inside of here we'll have your charger, making sure there's nothing extra in the box. There's nothing here. So that'll have your charger cable, and the plug to plug it to the wall. You won't be needing that right away. At that point, the box will be empty. There's our front basket. Front fender and front and rear fender, which we'll get to later. And one other thing I'm looking for, here we go. One moment, we have one more extra bag of much necessary parts. You'll see all of the parts that are in this particular bag are what you'll be requiring to assemble the rear end of the bike. So inside of this package, you'll have your chain, a 1-speed chain, cut and ready for that size of bike. Be very careful not to lose these 2 parts. This will be the master link to attach your chain, which will come shortly. And you'll have 6 bolts for attaching the rear triangle to the main frame. At this point, I also like to arrange all the nuts and bolts in order, just to save having to fish around for them later on. So you can organize them by size. You'll have 4 large bolts, which happen to be for the basket. You'll have a bunch of smaller bolts, which are M5 bolts. That's a 5mm shaft. I'm just going to put them all together so they're easy to find. And then we'll have some M6 bolts, which you'll see a thicker shaft. We'll use those on a different component. We'll outline each one of those as they come up. And then finally, you have a bunch of nuts and bolts. 4 nuts for your basket, and 4 others for the M5. Actually, 1 will be for each bolt. So we have 8 bolts. We should have 8 nuts for that too. And I am finding, there we have it. So there's 8. The washers, you'll see that they will actually fit the correct size bolt. So if you try to use a washer on the wrong size bolt or use an oversized washer on a smaller bolt, then you'll find you'll run out of these. So select the washers ahead of time. So we'll put the washers that suit the 5mm bolts all in one area. And they're pretty easy to identify. They all seem to look the same. And the ones that fit the M6 bolts, as you see here, fit those. So arrange them all together so that they're easy to access. So we'll have 8 of those, and there we go. And then this other little baggie will have a few more bits of hardware. And I'm going to do the same thing in organizing them. That, I believe, is going to be for your front fender and also the headlight. It will probably require a nut, and it'd be nice to finish it off with a washer. We'll have a few more M5 bolts that are, in this case, stainless steel bolts, and we'll put them all together. Those will be for holding the basket onto the front, and then there will be a couple more M6 bolts. We'll put those aside. Same goes for the washers. Arrange your washers all together. Arrange the nuts and the washers together with the other matching set. And we have one extra washer, which I'm going to use it on this side to go on the front and the rear of the fender and front light. And this will be your full arrangement of nuts and bolts. By appearances, we have everything we need to start. All right, also one of the last yet most important parts that will be in the box will be your battery. And that will be wrapped up in this foam. We'll get that later. That'll be one of the last things we install. And in the kit, we had a couple of tools. So in this kit, you have most of the tools that you need with the exception of a couple. 15mm spanner, which will be handy for putting the pedals on. That's right there. 8 and 10mm spanner, which will fit these nuts, so you got nuts there. 6mm Allen key, 5mm Allen key, and a 4mm Allen key. And then two other tools I would recommend. Again, metric tools. You may have a kit similar to this. We'll need an 8mm, which we are going to use to put the rear triangle on these large bolts. And it also doesn't come with a 17. I prefer to use a spanner. This one will have a ratcheting mechanism. You could also use a socket set. And if you don't have that, an adjustable crescent wrench will do the job also. And to do some fine adjustments if necessary, a Phillips screwdriver. So, the next step we're going to go to is to assemble the rear triangle. All right, here we go. Now we're going to start with the rear end of the bike, putting the rear triangle onto the bicycle. First, I'm going to just roll this forward, put my bolts down. You'll see the position of this thing we'll want to swing upside down, so we're going to turn it over so the platform where the basket goes will be up. Using that foam block will help as a stand. And we're going to guide the frame towards these 3 bolt holes, and we're just going to slide her together. Friction might be your friend here. We're going to put the bolts in one at a time. Washer on each side. So one washer stays on the bolt. I like to keep the hardware onto the inside so the nut will be inboard. The first nut will probably be the hardest. I'm going to use my knee. There we go. Now we have one in. Washer can be installed. And we'll just spin the nut on. And I'm going to install all 6 bolts in the same manner. So we go to the other side. You'll see the space is very tight in here. This is why we want to start this now. That'll stabilize the whole bike, keeping everything together. And all the rest of the bolts can go in any order you like. A little bit of struggling here. Well, we'll get that in there in a moment. There's another one. Another one, and the washers on 1 and 2, and we'll just loosely spin the nuts on. We have 2 last bolts going into the other side. And the 6th bolt will be our last one. These bolts will hold the rear triangle together onto the bike. Now for the next part. And this part here, we're just going to tension these bolts down, but we're going to leave them loose enough that the rear end can move on the bike. We use our 8mm Allen key, put that in the head of one of the bolts. You can use a spanner. You can turn the bolt one little turn at a time if you wish. In this case, I'm going to use the ratcheting side. And if it was a socket wrench, you can do the same. And we're just going to turn these down. I'm deliberately going to leave these bolts loose again. And the reason for that will be to assist on setting up the chain. The chain is quite a tricky part, and you certainly don't want this fixed into position so that you can't adjust the rear end to accommodate the chain. And there we go. So the rear end is still loose. And I'm just going to add a little bit of looseness to this one because I can feel it tightening. So we want the rear end to move. And that's going to make it much easier to install a chain. We won't need the foam block anymore. That can disappear as the bike is now supported under its own weight. And we're going to move on to the chain installation next. Here we go with the chain and the master link.
Go again with the chain.
So we're going to. So here we go with the chain and the master link. This part might be a little bit tricky. So what I'm going to do, straighten out the chain so there's no loops in it. The chain is a little bit greasy, so your hands will probably get a little bit greasy while you're doing this. We can hang the chain onto the chain ring. And you're going to notice one important detail I'm going to do next, and I'm not going to try to install the chain onto the sprocket yet. That will be what we're going to do very last on the process of the chain installation. I'm going to hang the chain loosely on the inside of the axle, very much like you see here. And now we can install the master link. With the chain having the slack that it does now, it will be very easy. As you can see, the chain is oversized or longer than it needs to be for the moment. We'll take the master link, install it on one side, take the chain, clip it into the other side. The plate, as you can see, it's on the floor here. You need fingernails for that. So now we're going to put the plate on. The plate, I put it into the link, and we just flex the chain and it will snap into place. So just flexing the chain, kind of like bending it, will allow the pins to come closer together, the plate will snap on, and now the chain is secured. And this is the part that is kind of the trick, and it's very important to follow this procedure. With the rear end loose, it will allow all of this to move forward. And so what we can do is we put the chain onto a couple of teeth on the freewheel. to hold it securely, and literally I'm just going to pedal it forward, and you might have to lift the bike a bit while doing so, and the chain will snap over the top of the teeth. So here I go, and there it is. That will make everything much easier, and this is a very important step for the pre-assembly of the bike. From here on in, everything gets much easier. Now that we have the chain on, now that we have the chain on,
After I say okay, just wait.
okay. Now that we have the chain on, you'll see that there'll be slack in the chain and the rear end is still moving. So we'll be able to use this to tension the chain and setting up the chain so that it's straight and securely attached to the bike. So going back to those two tools, the 8mm Allen key and the 17mm spanner, I'm going to tighten down one of these bolts in the beginning. Check the chain tension. You'll see that the tension is nice. And this will keep the whole drive side of the rear triangle stable. The chain will be secured, and the bike will be, the drivetrain or the chain line will be aligned with itself. Now we can go to the other side and tension that side. Here we go again. So I've snugged the bolts down, and now I'm just going to torque them tighter, securing everything down. So give it a good torquing. These are just like axle nuts, so you can put reasonable force on them as if you were tightening down a nutted wheel. And now we have the full frame, fully assembled, chain attached, rear triangle tightened, and now we go to the next step. All right, so now we're going to install the brake caliper to the brake mounts. First, we're just going to take off with our 5mm Allen key. We're going to remove the retention bolts. You'll notice that there's two washers here. One retaining washer and one spacer washer. The spacer washer will go in a particular location, which you'll see as we install this. So taking off the bolt, pretty straightforward. I'm just going to lay the washer on the floor very close to where I need it to be. And I'm going to remove the other bolt with both washers. Spacer washer I'm going to put on the floor. Oops, and one other thing. There's a protector to keep the hydraulic pistons from being pumped out of the brake pads, out of the caliper that is, leaving that space that you see in between, exactly as you see it. So this part is maybe a little bit tricky. What we want to do is install the bolt. We also want the spacer washer at the tip of the bolt there. And very, very carefully, we're going to install the brake in such a way that we don't knock all that stuff out of place. Patience will be required. So now we're going to mount the brake to the brake mount. You'll see it orients itself a certain way. It's pretty natural. brake mount will be to the bottom. We're going to install that nut or that bolt into place very, very carefully, trying hard not to knock our spacer washer off. Couple of turns to catch the threads, and there we have it. Now we're going to put the second bolt in. I'm going to move the brake caliper out of my way. Going to install the second bolt and my spacer washer. I'll hold this down with my fingertips so I don't knock the bolt back out of place. And I did this one last. Oops, there we go, dropping it. This might happen a couple of times, so be patient. There we are. Now I'm letting just a little bit of the thread show because I need room for everything to fit into that small space. So I'm going to rotate the caliper carefully into position, trying to let that bolt just pass. There we go. And now snug this down or finger tight it just so that I know that the threads are catching. And now we can secure it to the brake mount. I'm going to use the ball end side. Just makes it convenient to turn the Allen key from an angle. Same going on this one. And now with a little bit of torque, insert the Allen key. Try once more. And secure it till you feel some resistance, and you'll see by the effort I'm putting with my hand, you don't need to apply a lot of force to this. We don't need to strip the parts. Same goes with the rear one that we last mounted. Again, torquing it forward, or clockwise in this case. And now the brake is mounted. We'll look at centering that brake and adjusting it from the next step. Now we're going to move to the other side and install the other caliper in the exact same manner. Going to readjust cameras?
Just say that.
Now we're going to move to the other wheel, and we're going to attach the next caliper in the exact same manner that we attached the first one. Okay, here we go now. Now we're just going to do the other side in the same procedure. Remove the safety puck. I'm going to take the two bolts out. I'm going to put the spacer washer on the floor, close by where I need it, and the bolt. Same with the rear one. Same with the bolt. One suggestion I would strongly make to anybody doing this, wherever you're doing it, is to do it on a clean, flat floor. So should you drop anything, it will be easily retrieved. If you do this on a deck and it falls between your boards, you're going to have a hard time finding your parts. So, first the bolt like before, spacer washer in place. Carefully mount the front of the brake mount. And one thing I'll add right now is that the cable or the brake line can be twisted one way or the other. If you choose the orientation, and you'll see here I'm curving it in such a way that it's going to go up and over the top. If I twist it the other way, I can still go over the top, but the cable will resist itself. So allow it to use its natural flow. So here we go. Rotate the caliper down to the position. Try not to knock off your spacer washer. Thread it a few turns so that it catches the brake mount. And I can feel right now it is not catching. So I don't want to release anything so I don't drop any parts. And there we go. So now I have that in position. I'm going to rotate the brake caliper forward again like before and install the last bolt and the spacer washer with it. So the last bolt in. Very, very carefully put your spacer washer in. Try to leave about 2 or 3 threads showing. Carefully rotate your brake into place. And try to pick up a couple of threads onto the brake mount. And now we can begin to tension it down into position. So I'm just going to tighten it down with the ball end. We normally don't use the ball end of an Allen key to tighten the bolt fully, as the ball end has very small contact surface area to the Allen key or the head that you're installing it to. So I'm just picking up all the slack, and now you can secure the brake into place. A little bit of tension there, and a little bit of tension there. Now our brakes are positioned. And we're going to move on to the next step, where we're going to move to the handlebars and the front wheel. And now for the mounting of the handlebars. So we're going to move down here. 2 tools we're going to require is a 5 millimeter Allen key and a 4 millimeter Allen key. And one other thing I'll be showing is some grease. This happens to be into a syringe, but a little bit of any kind of grease, like an assembly grease or a wheel bearing grease, which we're going to use on the headset to secure and make sure everything's proper there and give it a little bit of added protection. You'll see that there's a zip tie on the top. You can just wiggle this down or wiggle it up and away. We won't need that anymore. And what we're going to inspect is the headset bearings. The headset bearings control the steering of the bike and stabilize the front end. There will be a flange on the steer column. This part of the fork is referred to as a steer column. We'll take the flange off. Underneath that flange will be the bearing retainer washer, which will keep the fork from wiggling as you see here. And what I often like to do when I'm assembling a bike is put a little bit of grease in this area so that it keeps it quiet, keeps it rust free, and might make some of the noises go away that might develop as the bike ages. The flange will have a bit of an angle to it, which that angled portion will be going down into the bearing that's mounted in the top. I'm just going to put that down for a moment. I'm going to rotate the bike backwards a bit, and you'll see similar type flange below. And I'm just going to put a little tiny bit of bearing grease on here, just a tiny bit. It's not actually to pack the bearing, just to give a smooth, slippery surface so that nothing binds and nothing creaks. So we do that to the front, to the bottom, and I'll put a little dab on the steer column, and I'll just smear that around with my fingertip. You wipe the extra into the steer column there. So the retaining washer, or the upper bearing retaining washer, will go with the tapered side down. Doesn't matter where the split goes. We can put that down. We have the flange. It's more of a decorative part. Makes everything look more stylish. And now we're ready to mount the stem and the handlebar. So the stem will have a hole in it where the steer column is going to go inside, and inside that hole you'll see a bolt, which will be the one that's going to tighten into something called a star nut. The star nut is down inside the steer column here, and that bolt that I just showed you will thread down into that star nut. So as we raise the bar into position, it will just simply fall over. If for whatever reason it doesn't go down, you may loosen these bolts a tiny bit and it will press down easier. In order to access the retention bolt, we are going to need to do 2 things. One, open the stem, and there'll be a little lever here.
That section again. In order to
Okay.
loosen
in order to tighten the retainer bolt, we'll have to do two things. One, press on this to open the stem, and this will give you access to the hole where the 5mm Allen key will go in. And another thing that I will mention is that the fork needs to be turned around to the correct direction. Oops. So we're going to spin that fork around so the arch of the fork is facing forward. Now we're ready to go. So with the 5mm Allen key, I am going to carefully place it down that hole, and I'm going to find the head of the Allen key. I'll begin turning, and it should pilot itself into the star nut that's inside of the steer column. And eventually, after a few turns, you'll feel it begin to snug up. This is not something that needs to be tightened. This is something that is an adjustment. Should you tighten it, it will make the steering resist turning and make the turning more difficult, and the bike will tend to want to hold its line as opposed to flowing down the trail easily. So this I'm just going to adjust, and one way I'll know that it's adjusted correctly is by the lack of wiggle in the fork. So if I should lift the bike up and try to make the fork move back and forth, as it doesn't now, but this is a symptom that will happen if it's not correct. I'm just going to back it off a little bit. And if you listen to the sound here, you might hear a little knocking. And you can even see it visually as the fork is moving side to side or back and forth in some cases. So I'm going to put this back down again and go back to the setting I had originally. So I'm just going to adjust it, and you'll see I'm just using my fingertips. I'm not using any type of force on this part. Now I can put the handlebar into approximately the position that we're going to ride it at. So the bar is adjustable and as well can be rotated. And from the front here, you can see that there's some notches in the bar and a little bit of a bulge. We want this bulge centered into the stem. We don't want a little bit showing on one side or the other if we can avoid it. And that way the stem will be gripping the handlebar, keeping it secure, and keeping it in the position you want. So I'm just going to... So we have to center it, and then I'm going to rotate the handlebar approximately where I want it, and then I could lock the stem down, and in this case the stem is still loose from the factory setting. So what we do is just reverse whatever we did here. I'm going to open the stem one more time. Behind the stem you'll see this long shaft. It's actually loose in this case, and what we do is just put some tension on that. So I'm going to just mock it up. I'm going to put some approximate amount of force. Now this is kind of a feel thing. So what I'm going to do is put a little bit of force, and I'm going to feel for some resistance at the lever. This seems to go down very easily, so the bar may not be tightened enough should I lock it into place, kind of like what I'm going to show you now. So I think it's locked, and it appears to be secure, but I can move the handlebar still. So again, open the stem up. We're going to continue to turn the adjustment and the tensioning shaft down. And you'll notice that everything starts to sort of lock into position now. So I put a little bit more tension. You'll see now here I'm putting a bit more force to close it. And I'm going to put just a tiny bit more. I'm going to rotate my bar to where I think I like it, making sure that that bulge is still centered. We're going to lock her down into position. And there we are. We're a little bit more secure. Before we finish the entire job, one of the last steps we're going to do is adjust it for body position. So this is just to set us up and make it easier to do the next steps as we go. So the next step will now be mounting the front wheel. And before we mount the front wheel, we'll put the fender on because the fender will be in the way of the wheel as we're trying to install it. So now we're going to get ready to mount the fender. In the first stage we need to do is to assemble the fenders. So the front fender is the shorter one. It will come in wrapped up nice and well protected into our foam. The fender will have two holes in it. You'll notice the holes aren't in the center, So what we would like to do is we're going to make the shorter distance will be the front. So the wheel will be going in that direction. These are the fender mounts here. We got 4 for the rear and 1 for the front. It will be mounted very much like that. And then we have our M6 bolts. They're 6mm stainless steel bolts, which we're going to install into here. With your thumb, you can hold the bolts in position. You can turn this over. You can mount 2 washers to the bolts, and then spin the nuts into position. These could be mounted in the other direction if you should choose to. I like to see minimalist hardware, keeping everything nice and clean. So with the 5mm Allen key that's provided and the 10mm spanner they provided, we can snug these down. And you could see that this will go side to side a bit. You may wish to adjust that as we finish up here, and I'll show you that as we go. So simply starting with this, I can tighten these nuts down into position. That's snug now. Go to the back side, snug that down. Now the fender is pretty much straight. I'm going to just loosen one of these nuts because to me this fender is a little tiny bit off. So just back that off a little bit. You can sort of gun sight it from the top. Aim that forward. That looks pretty good now. And we're going to snug these down. So there's the front fender ready for mounting. We're going to do the same for the rear now. So the rear 2 fenders will be set up the same way. We'll have 4 bolt holes. These bolts are equal distance from both sides, so you can't make a mistake by accidentally putting it backwards or forward. I'll unwrap the next one. And here we go again. Now because each fender will be on one side or the other of the bike, for style points, we want the fender to look like this, and one here, and then the opposite sides. So the same thing goes once again. Put the M6 bolt in here. Put a washer on the underside if you like. Actually, for style points, because of this hole, I would like to add a little bit more reinforcement. I'm going to put a washer on the top of this particular one because we are going to do some adjustment, and I wouldn't want the bolt to slip into a different position. That'll be more understood as we go further. So, 2 bolts on one end, 2 bolts on the other. You'll notice that these things will be pointed in a downward direction, and that's going to meet up to the basket. When the basket is finally installed, and it's these will be some of the last pieces we install so that we can have access to tuning any parts, especially the rear brake, which would be covered by the basket if we should install that a little bit too soon. Unlike the front fender, these bolts aren't going to be tightened all the way. And I just caught myself. I'm going to make a little change here because I wanted that washer on the other side. Actually, it's already there. I would have had one missing part. So at this stage right now, we're just going to snug these down. They don't have to be tight. I'll explain later as we go. But we'll need a little bit of wiggle room for centering the fender and also making sure that the bolt holes will align to where they're going to be mounted to. So just tight enough that it's not going to fall apart while we're assembling it. Very much like that. So same on the other bolts there. the Allen key in, and you can be creative and do it a different way from the top side. And if you have a socket set, sometimes that makes things a little bit quicker too. So there's one fender for one side. If you should accidentally do both fenders the same way, because they're left and right and they are exactly the same position, when you rotate it, it will be correct. But for the sake of the camera, I am going to mount them the opposite way so that they're a mirror image of each other. Starting with first one M6 bolt, mounted into the top of the fender, and the nut on the bottom side. One more M6 bolt on the top of the fender and mounted to the underside. Then the last fender mount bracket. Whoops, I missed a detail. I put the washer on the wrong side of the head. Making this mistake won't be critical. I liked everything to look the same on both sides, hence the mirror image thing I mentioned. So for style points, it just looks a little bit better. Again, washer into the bolt, or the bolt into the washer, into the mount, into the hole, and the nut on the back side. And this will now be our last M6 bolt for the Fender kit. So now we no longer have to worry about that little package of bolts that are there. And once again, a little bit of tension, but not so much that everything's locked up. So these we're just going to put aside because they will be going on with the basket. And now we're going to move next to mounting this front fender with the light, the mounting bolt that comes with it. So it'll be the single bolt, which is also an M6, comes with a 10mm washer, and we have 10mm nut and 2 washers for it. One that I will use on the front. I will pass this through here right now. And it's going to be mounted to the fork, very much like you see here. And then that will pass through the bridge of the fork, which we'll move to next. A washer will go on the back side, and a nut to hold everything in position. So let's move to the next step. Okay, so now we're going to mount the front fender and the light to go with it. So we have our fender. We have our light. We have that M5 bolt, so I'm just going to insert that into the light as I showed you earlier. I'm going to mount that through the fender hole. There's a hole on the fork bridge, or the arch of the fork, which that M5 bolt is going to pass through. In this case, it happens to be threaded. So this bolt, with the 5mm Allen key provided in your toolkit, can be snugged into position. I'm just going to put a little bit of tension on it so I can fine-tune the final position I want this. The fender has a bit of room to go up and down. This would normally be to accommodate the tire so that it doesn't rub on the bottom. I happen to know that there's a lot of clearance on this. But for style points, again, I like everything compact, so I'm going to bring the fender up. I'm going to keep the light in a lower position, and I'm just going to tighten it from the front. And because the light fell over and I don't want to force anything that's plastic, I'm going to hold it carefully into position, approximate it to be vertical, add a bit more tension. Because this is threaded, the provided nut that they gave you for the backside Really isn't necessary, but I'm going to put it there just in case, because it's provided and I don't want to throw it away. So here we go. I'm just going to snug this into where I want it. You'll see that the fender may tilt or move from one side or the other. The light I don't want to manipulate. I'm going to just take a look at the fender to see the gap, making sure that it seems to be level. And that can be fine-tuned when you're finished, but presetting it might make your job a little bit easier. The 10mm nut they provided, I'm now going to put on the back side. And fortunately, there's enough room in here to get your hand. If you had a socket, you can come from the back. But I'm just going to spin this down. It's going to be about 12 threads. So with a half turn on each one, it's going to take me about 24 tries to spin this guy down. I'll just keep turning that guy down. We're almost at the bottom. There we go. I can feel some resistance now. And just put a little bit of tension. And that's fine. There's the front fender. We're going to stop here and then we're going to mount the front wheel. That's going to come next. Okay, here we go. We're ready to mount the front wheel. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to take off this little shipping brace, just a little plastic piece that's in the way here, and the disc brake protector. Those pieces we will no longer need. We'll have the front wheel here now. You'll see the front wheel was going to have its power supply cable, and it's protected with a plastic cover over the plugs, and it's zip tied to the spoke. So we'll unzip tie it from the spoke because we won't need it attached anymore. I'll leave the plug on now just in case something happens if we drop the wheel or bump it against something, because the plugs are rather fragile. So leave that on until the very last moment. So the motor side of the wheel, or sorry, the wire side of the wheel will be on the same side that the power supply is on. And the disc brake will of course be where the disc brake side is mounted here. In the package is included some safety washers. You'll see these flat washers with a little bit of a hook to them. Well, we'll take those out of the packaging and we're going to put them underneath the washers that are provided from the factory here. So taking off one nut, we'll remove the disc brake side nut. There will be a washer and a second washer, and the washer is going to have a notch to it. That notch will be fitting into the dropout or the place where the wheel mounts into the fork. The safety washer is going to mount to a little hole that's very difficult to see, but it will be there above the axle. So I'm just going to hang this piece on. I'm going to put the washer over it and just loosely tighten down the nut. Same on the motor side. Remove the nut. Remove the first washer. You'll see the wire exits the bottom, and here is the washer that prevents the wheel from rotating inside the dropout. You'll see that the raised portion of the washer is oriented towards the wire. So should it fall off, just make sure it goes back in that same position. We'll put the safety washer on, and it has a notch, so it could be mounted one way or the other. We want it to go the opposite direction of the bump that's provided for the retainer. Then the final washer can go above, and we can just snug that on a couple of turns. Now we're going to position the wheel into the fork. So the first thing I'm going to do, move all of this hardware away, keeping the inner washer all the way to the axle. I can lift the wheel and I can rest it into the fork blades. So now it's in position. The safety washers will fit into a very small hole that's right there above the axle. And we'll see it right in front of my fingertip, and that's where it wants to go. So it will go into that hole. We can spin that nut down. On the flip side, I'm going to do the same thing as you just saw a moment ago, and we'll snug that down. With the wheel being supported vertically, we know that the wheel won't be able to be mounted crooked. In other words, moving from one side or the other. So I'm going to use an old-fashioned tool, an adjustable crescent wrench, as I didn't bring a 19mm spanner with me this time. So I'm just going to gently snug one side, gently snug the other side. Now that I know it's where I want it to be, put a bit more force in it. So these nuts do need to be retained very well. So you'll see me putting a bit more effort into it. So I'm going to snug it up. It's still turning. And now I'm feeling more resistance. You can sort of hear by my voice that I'm giving it a bit more. And I go to the other side. And I'm just going to rotate that clockwise and give it some force. Front wheel is now mounted. And then the next step, and we can do this now, we can take the little protective cover off of the plug. We'll take that protective thing off of the plug. There's the plug pins that we want to make sure are not going to get damaged or bent, and we can see that they are straight. If for whatever reason this had been damaged, the pins might be crooked, so you want them to look like they're in this orientation. You'll notice that they're of different lengths and heights, and that is on purpose. It might be difficult to see. Oh, here it is on this one. You'll see an arrow on the plug, on the male part of the plug, and on the female part of the plug, you'll see also that arrow. So these two arrows are going to point towards each other as they go down into the plug. And the next thing I do is I'm going to bring this up. I'm going to align those arrows so that they're pointing towards each other. I'm going to push this together and then give it quite a bit of force. And we want that gap between the two arrows to be roughly about 8mm, less than a centimeter. Should this not be put in correctly, you might not get power to the motor and you will get an error code. So the simplest thing you can do to diagnose your own issues is to make sure that this wire is secured. And because I'm at this stage now, I'm going to grab a zip tie and I'm going to secure this wire to this bracket right here. So with one of the zip ties that they provided you, just pass that through the little gap, pass the tail of it through, zip it down, and there we go. She's nice and tight. We can cut off the excess with our cutters. Front brake is all set up. Give it a squeeze. And we're not going to worry about the adjustment until the last part, should it even need to be adjusted. And that's starting to look like a bike. Just as style points, you'll see the front tip is down a little bit lower than the rear. This being metal, you can just sort of flex it into position. And there we go. So now it looks a bit more equal on both sides. Style points, it's got to look good. We're already here now with the light. You'll see the red connector and the red receiver. You can mount these and you'll see a little notch there and a little notch on the inside. They need to align themselves together, and then you'll press that down. And simple as that, your front light is now connected. Now we're ready to move on to the next step. Okay, now we got just about every mechanical part set up on the bike. I just want to do a little pre-check before I bury any of these parts. In other words, mounting more parts that might make it difficult to do any final adjustment. So I'm going to lift up the front wheel, and I'm just going to have a listen to the brake and make sure that it's rotating smoothly. And as you can see here, it's making no sound, picked up by the microphone I have on me, and the wheel is rotating nicely. I'm going to move to the back wheels where the brakes are also mounted. I'm just going to tilt the bike a little, give it a spin, and we're not hearing any noise. There's usually like a rub or almost a hissing sound that you might get. In this case, it's not doing so. And the other side, there we go. It's rotating nicely, and it's not rubbing the brake and stopping very, very fast. If it should stop quickly, then the brake might be out of center. There will be another video that you can visit that will show you how to do a brake centering, and that you'll do before mounting the basket. But now that we know this is correct, we're going to move to the next couple steps. One step, now that we're at the rear end of the bike, we have the rear tail light here, and you'll see another set of plugs, red, just like the front one. So we're going to just mount them the same way. You have that little tab that we want to line up to each other. So we just go underside here, and I'm going to plug that in, and the light's done. You'll see these cables are just dangling in the way, and we preset that angle about rotating the brake lines. So that gives that nice arc that we can put a zip tie onto this and just neaten up that brake cable. And there it is. That looks nice and pretty. And do the same on the other side. I'll put a zip tie in here, pass the tail through the buckle, if you want to call it that. You'll notice that I put it on the inside between the two struts here. That way the cable doesn't want to move on its own. We can cut off the excess off the tail now. And with this rear tail light, I want to sort of neaten that up too. I don't really like it hanging out like that. You've been provided quite a few zip ties. So again, I put this one on separately. I don't want to have that attached to the brake system as well. So we just tighten that up. And that keeps everything as a nice little bundle passing through the side of the frame. Next, we're going to mount the pedals. So the pedals, as we saw earlier, they came in this package. You take the shrink wrap off the packaging and the cardboard spacer. The pedals are going to be left and right, and they will also be left and right hand threads. One of the pedals will have little notches on the part where you turn the pedal down. The left side pedal will have the notches. The right side pedal will be without them. So this is being the right, and this being the left. I'm going to set them up now. We always put grease on the pedal threads, so just a tiny bit of grease on the thread, and the same for the right hand pedal. And that's just to keep the pedal from seizing up and also torquing down easily. With the 15mm spanner that was provided, we'll be able to torque the pedal down with that. So being a left-hand thread, it turns counterclockwise to tighten. So not clockwise like this, but counterclockwise like that. So we just position it towards the hole. You'll start wiggling or turning it down, and it'll start catching a thread. Almost had it there for a moment. Sometimes the initial thread might be a little bit difficult. There we go. We don't want to force it. You can see I'm just using my fingertips and the wrench is practically falling. So if you're putting a lot of force to get past this point, it's either in crooked or you've accidentally selected the right hand pedal and you're beginning to force it on. But it'd be impossible to put a right hand pedal while turning it counterclockwise. So we turn this counterclockwise until it hits bottom, and this pedal, or in this area, you can put pretty much as much force as you can push through a regular crescent wrench. So now we know that's solid. The right hand pedal, same thing, except it's going to turn on clockwise. I'm doing it from the back side here. So we start the thread. There we go. And you can see she's turning in without much force, so we know we're not stripping the thread or binding anything. And now we can just begin torquing it down. Here's a bike shop secret. You can pedal her backwards. Same on the left thread. And now when you hit bottom, give it pretty much everything you got. Now your pedals are secure. Next thing we're going to do, we'll put in the seat post, and we're going to finish off after that by mounting the, we're going to mount the seat post. Then we're going to just give this a little bit of a test spin before we mount the basket, making sure everything's correct, and I think we'll be very close to done. So a little bit of grease inside of the seat tube. There we go. Seat post will go in. If the seat post doesn't go in, it might be because the quick release is already tight or over tightened. So we can mount the seat post in there, and that kind of holds the post. At this point, that closed very easily, so you'll notice that I can turn the seat. Adding tension to a quick release, and this goes the same for any quick release, you'll back this off. There's a nut on the opposite side. You can put some tension on that nut, then you can close the quick release. The way the proper action of a quick release, you'll begin to feel tension at the 90-degree point, and then you'll force it or push it shut, and you'll see that I'm not putting a lot of force into it. If you're hammering it or hitting it shut, you're making it too tight, and the quick release will wear out faster. And now the seat is tight. So that's ready to go. I'm just going to put this thing down all the way. Look at it from the top so that the nose or the horn of the saddle is facing forward in line with the frame. Tighten her down. And now your Trio is beginning to look more like a trike. So the next step is going to take it for a little test spin just to make sure everything feels right before I mount the basket. So here we go. Okay, before I mount the basket in the rear fenders and covering up all of the mechanical parts I may need to do a final adjustment on, I'm going to take this bike for a quick test drive as it is right now, knowing that the seat is tight and the bars are somewhat where I need them to be. So, hopping on the bike, feet on the pedals, we don't need the battery power, and so now we go. Bike is rolling. Brakes are stopping. You'll see that my hands are in a low position. I'd like them a little bit higher. The brake levers are a little on the high side, so I will be adjusting them to a more natural position, as I'll explain. But at this point, I'm very satisfied with the bike, the way the bike is riding. So here we go. The next step is to mount the basket in the rear fenders. So here we are. Okay, well now we're going to mount the fenders. So we have the two rear fenders. They're going to mount to these tabs that are on the basket. And these brackets are going to line up to those holes that the tabs are mounted to. Starting with M5 bolts, 5mm bolt using a 4mm Allen key. We'll put a washer on the back side of it. We'll simply put past one, putting the brackets towards the inside of the basket, I'm going to find the hole. There she is. Spin one down, and I'm going to mount each bolt one at a time as we go. And you'll see by my bit of struggling here as to why I left those bolts on the top loose. Because if I tightened them, we'd be struggling a bit more to get them into these holes. So that's just finger tight. We know it's in the hole. Another bolt and washer. Spin that in finger tight. And the fourth one. Washer on the bolt. You may have to push the bracket down as the fender acts like a spring and wants to pull it away. You'll find the fourth one a little bit more difficult. So be patient as you're getting it in there. I think I have it, but I'm afraid it might be crooked. I'm going to observe it visually. I will use the ball end of the Allen key. I'm going to gently snug that down, making sure it doesn't feel like it's going to bind up. And that's okay. Just with my thumb there, I'm not putting any force, so I know I'm not stripping that bolt. So now, I can tighten these down, but turn these down, but not so tight that they're actually locked up, because I may want to fiddle with the fender's position later on. But it's easier to do it off the bike than on the bike. Down, back it up a bit so I can move it. And we continue here. These bolts will have a bit more resistance. You may even notice a bit of an angle to it. Everything wants to act like a spring. That's okay. It'll all set up fine when we're finished. So there's one side. We'll leave that snug but not tight. That's kind of how it's going to look. And now we'll move to the other side. So we got our 4 bolts and washers. I'm just going to speed things up a little bit by mounting the washers to the bolts right away. And just like before, brackets to the inside of the plate, bolt through the bracket, into the plate. One goes in kind of finger tight, might be a little tight thread, so I'm just going to give her a bit of a spin. Yes, that's nice. Mount one to the next bracket. All right, I'm observing something here that might be of a bit of a help for those who are going to be assembling their bikes. You'll see that there's a bit of a gap here as it wants to line up to the 2 holes. So I'm actually just going to gently bend the fender, because it's acting like a spring, and just to bring that a little bit closer. It takes a little bit of struggle out of things. Don't add so much force to the fender when you're trying to flex it that way. because you don't want to kink the fender and put a crease in it. It won't make the fender unfunctional, but again, you want this to look nice when you're done. Some of you might be observing this and wondering why I'm not using a power tool. I wanted to make this video simple, but it would be okay if you do have a electric drill with a reversing chuck and maybe even a torque meter in it, where you could mount a 4mm Allen key tip and do exactly what I'm doing and save yourself many seconds of time. You can time what I'm doing here, and you can shorten that to seconds with a power tool, remembering always to prime the screws, because power tools often aren't forgiving to when they start damaging things. And again, just snugging it into position, because we may want to change something or fine-tune something later. There it is. So we now have our basket fully set for mounting. Where the chains are, you have your tailgate. That will be towards the back of the trike. We'll be using the 4mm M6 bolts, and of course the 10mm nuts to hold them up. So here we go to the rear end of the bike to set it all up. So we'll place the basket onto the deck. You'll see 4 bolt holes and 4 bolt holes into the basket. We'll just align those there. We know that the tailgate will open towards the back, and with these long 6mm bolts, we're going to insert them into the mounting holes. So one goes there, one there. Sometimes the stampings and the weldings require a little bit of help. There we go. We'll need our 5mm Allen key. I'm just going to spin the 4th bolt down. It seems to always go in with a little bit of resistance. So I'm just going to spin that down so I can feel the bolt coming out of the bottom, and that will allow me to mount the nuts to it. Now this isn't actually snugging anything in. It's not a mechanical connection, even though when you're doing this you'll feel some resistance. So I'm going to reach for the 4 bolts now, or 4 nuts actually. And the 10mm provided spanner that came with the kit. You can just spin the nuts on the bottom. I might also mention that the nuts are nylock nuts, so you'll see a nylon portion on the one side and then the threaded portion on the other side. The nylon portion, of course, will go to the outside. You'll find that out fairly easily when you're trying to mount it backwards, that it really won't mount. We spin those guys into place, and the nylock nut won't allow you to turn them all the way down until you hold them into place with a spanner. And the last one. I'm just going to move around the other side of the bike. Now we can snug it into position. So I'm going to hold the nut into place with the spanner, and I'll use the Allen key to tighten everything down. And again, going back to what I said before about the power tools, that could come in handy because there's a long way down before these threads all disappear. And actually, here's a tip. If you open the tailgate, you get a little bit more range of motion to turning everything. There we are. At least this side. And be patient, there's a long way down before all those threads disappear. Now I can feel some resistance. There she's snug, and a little bit of torque. If you put a lot of torque, it will continue to go down, and you can collapse the tubing. It'll just look ugly, and it doesn't need that much force to tighten this basket on. Gravity is on your side for holding it into place. And now we'll just go to the second bolt, and we're going to continue to do this until all 4 bolts are tight. There's some resistance, and just a little bit more, and that's now tight. Now I'm going to go to the other side here. All right, here we go again. And finally, that bolt is tight. Now we can align the fenders and snug them into position. We're going to go back to the 4mm Allen key, and we're going to tighten the smaller bolts that hold the fender onto the brackets. I'm liking the position so far in terms of the height and so on. So I'm just going to snug these down. You might notice these little gaps here. Just make them the same, just for style points. Makes everything look nicer. Now I'm going to move to the other side. Do the same thing on there. Little gaps are the same. That looks nice. Spin one of them down. And the next one down. And the finicky spot over here, we'll tighten those guys down. And the last and final one on this part. Now I'm going to move to the other side as I switch tools. I'm going to go back to the 5mm, which is going to go into the top bolts. And the other thing I'm going to do is, if you look from above, you'll see that the fender is not exactly in line with the tire. And the reason why I left these just snug is so I can just fine tune the fender, make her look nice and pretty. I can level it a bit. I like the way that looks. Grab my 10mm spanner, hold it on the bottom, snug that one. Snug the other one. Finding that bolt might be, there we go, that nut might take a bit. That's tight. And you'll see again the effort that I'm tightening them. These don't have to be cranked like they're wheel nuts. The nylock nuts should prevent them from vibrating loose. And I'm just going to go to the other side and repeat the same thing. So here we are again. I can do that. This one I'm going to move away a bit. That looks pretty good. I like the way that looks. Hold that nut with the 10mm spanner. Spin the bolt down. That's snug. Find the other nut, spin that one down, go for one more nut, spin the bolt down, and the last fender nut. We now have an almost complete trio. And now we have an almost complete trio. The final details we're going to do is going to be a little bit to do with body position, how to mount the battery. We're going to open up the charger and we're going to open up the battery actually, and open up the charger, showing you how the charger will be plugged into the battery and how you can install and remove the battery from your trio. So the first thing, well actually for the next thing, we're going to move to the handlebars. I'm going to sit in the saddle. I'm just going to sort of mock up how I would like the bike to feel, and I'll explain why and how that might suit you, or how you might change that to suit yourself. So here we go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the handlebars into a natural position, and I'm going to explain kind of how that feels, and also final centering the bar, because everything was just put on loose. So just hop onto the bike as if you were the rider or are about to ride it. I'm going to mount the bar, aim the bike forward so the tire is forward, but the bars are going slightly to the left. So on the side, you have some pinch bolts that will allow you to adjust the bar to center it for forward. So I'm just going to loosen these off a tiny bit, and you'll probably notice almost instantly that the bar is going to start swinging around a little bit. So now it's loose, and there we are. Bar is turning. So you just sort of eyeball it straight. So I'm centering it to the tire. That feels like it's straight. I'm aiming in that direction. That looks good to me. So I'm satisfied with the bars being centered to the wheel now. So this, I'm now going to snug into position, and this will be pretty much a final adjustment for the handlebar, or for the centering of the handlebar.
I was just like, don't say anything, just keep on doing your thing.
Yeah, so here I'm just snugging.
Don't say anything.
And now that's tensioned enough. Now the next step is to adjust for body position. Body position is a personal thing, but I'm going to set it up for myself, and it should be about the same for the way I appear as it will be for yourself. So first thing I want to do is I want to get the bars level and adjusted to the height I'd like. Personally, I like a bar that's fairly low, but to adjust it, remember how we had that little safety lever? So there's a little lever on this side of the stem. You'll move forward, and then you'll open your stem up. Your bars will begin to rotate, and you might be able to move it. In this case, it's quite snug. The angle here I'm quite happy with, so I'm not going to change that. But if you wanted to raise the bar or lower the bar more, that initial torsion bar here that I mentioned will allow you to raise and lower it. Actually, for the sake of the video, I'm going to show you it again. So going back to now the 5mm Allen key, I'm going to insert it into the back of the tensioning bar. I'm just going to loosen it a bit, and you'll see right away the stem wanted to fall down. So you can adjust this stem very high. You can set it up as low as this. Personally, I like this position. So I'm just going to add a little bit of tension so that it will tighten down to that same spot. Checking tension, that's a little bit on the loose side. I give it a bit more, and it doesn't take much. This is an adjustment, not a tightening. It is the lever that will tighten your stem. Just a tiny, tiny bit more. All right, I feel some resistance. The stem is centered to the handlebar. Remember I mentioned about the notches and the bulge. You might have moved it left or right. Just take a look into this area here again, seeing it's centered. Handlebar position, in terms of your fit, when you're steering a bicycle, if the bars are too far away, you'll end up steering like this. It'll be hard on your back, and the bike will be controlling you more than you'll be controlling the bike. So what you'd like to have is a nice natural bend to your elbow. So that way when you're turning it, as you can see, I'm not making a big effort. I'll trick it by sitting back. So if it was too far away as I'm pretending to sit now, see how my shoulders are going? It's not natural. But in the right position, with a little bend to your elbow, it's comfortable. And another personal choice is the angle of the bar. So this is actually pretty comfortable, but I actually like something a little different. So again, I'm going to open the stem up. I'm going to rotate the bar, and I kind of like that position right there. That feels good to me. Now it's locked into position. So we got the body position set up. And then the final thing is the brakes. So the brakes should be easy to access. You shouldn't have to feel like you let go of the bars to grab them. At this point right now, should I hit a bump, I might sort of lose control of the bike. So I'd like to be able to keep my hands on the bars and just go with the brake, and quite literally with a hydraulic brake like this, in the power that it has, or any disc brake for that matter, 2 fingers should be all you require to access the brake. So I'm going to pull out my 4mm Allen key once again. On the back of the brake, we have 2 bolts on the brake retaining plate. I'm going to loosen So now I've loosened the retaining plate and the brake lever is free to go almost wherever it wants. Position your bike naturally. I find a natural position on the brake is if you just hold your arm straight and your fingertips straight out and lower to the handlebar, the brake lever should be pretty much right below your fingertips. So they shouldn't be down like this and they shouldn't be up like that. So natural, rotate it, that's a good spot. And then tighten both of those bolts down again. And now you've picked a natural position where I don't have to let go of the bars in order to hit the brakes. Very important safety feature. This bolt can be snugged down. It doesn't have to have a lot of force tightening it. And you'll see 1 finger is all I need. There's something called a parking brake on this, and it's on both brake levers. So when you squeeze the brake lever all the way, there's a little tiny lever that will click back, and it leaves the brake locked up. And if I try to push the bike forward, she doesn't want to go. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to set up the other brake in the same position as I did here. Now for the other lever. Just like I did on the first one, we're going to loosen the mounting or the backing plate or the mounting plate. Now the brake lever is free to go where it likes. And the same thing, fingers out straight, lower the brake, lower your arm, bring the brake to just below your fingertips, and now snug down the retention plate or the backing plate and put her in position. To ensure symmetry, if that's important to you, which it is to me, I'm going to undo the parking brake. I'm going to look from this angle here, just to observe that they both look that they're equal. They may not always be equal. You might have a shorter arm or maybe a broken wrist that may cause that to be, or a once broken wrist that may have caused your hand position to be different. But for style points, I like symmetry. That looks great. And again, like I say, not a lot of force. I'm just putting a little bit of force on that to tighten it. And now we got the brakes at a natural, safe position where it's comfortable to reach. I've got a natural position for my handlebars where I'm not punching out or reaching, extending for the bar. I'm right over the bike nicely. I'm comfortable and upright, at least the way I would like to be. You may like it higher, that's okay. But find what's natural for you. And these adjustments are all here to customize the bike to your fit. And for the final details, we're about to move to putting in the battery, and I still have the front basket that we haven't mounted yet. So we'll put the front basket on, and then I'm going to put the battery into position. I'm going to explain the charger and how you should use that. And, well, while we're here, you also have this display on the front. And right now it's angled forward. This happens to be loose, but again, it requires a smaller Allen key. In this case, I believe it's a 2.5. You would push this or move this. If it's very tight, don't force it. Loosen the Allen keys first. Position this so it's getting a nice visual position for you. And if that looks good, that's where you sort of snug it down. At this stage, I'm not going to snug it down. I'm just going to leave that for somebody else's personal adjustment, and we're going to go to that. Just for fun, I'm going to put our parking brakes on as I go to mounting the front basket. That looks good. I like it. Now we're ready to mount the last accessory that comes with the bicycle, the front basket. This basket's going to mount to the 4 mounting bolts on the very front of the head tube of the bike, and you'll have 4 bolts or 4 holes that it will line up to. Using the M5 bolts that were provided, we're going to place one through a hole, line it up to any one of these holes, What I want to do to also show is that the cables have run over the top of, that square. And that's a very simple adjustment. This actually came out of the box set up that way. All right, so here we go. Lining it up to the hole. Spinning it on by finger. Come on. There we go. So we get one bolt. Go for a second one. It's going to line up for the other one that's under there. One more bolt there. And the fourth bolt right over here. And with our 4mm Allen key, we can spin these into position. And that's going to be our last bolt. We've torqued it into position. And now that we got the basket on, we just want to make sure that there's room for the headlight. So the headlight's in an upward position. I'm just going to lower it down and bring it down a little bit more. That way when the fork compresses, it's not going to hit the bottom of the basket. And once we've done that, we can snug it down with our 4mm Allen key, on the Allen bolt. And that takes care of that. So now we're going to go to the final step of putting the battery on. I'm going to show you how the battery mounts and how the charger works, and that will conclude the video. All right, so we're about to mount the battery. In order to get your battery in, it's going to fit into this position behind the seat. There's a little lever under the seat that'll allow you to tilt it forward to mount the battery in there. Here's the battery. It comes with the keys. We have one key that we've put inside of it. The key will be required to turn the battery on, off, and to unlock it and remove it from the bicycle. You'll see a retaining pin that will fit into this rail that's down on the bicycle frame. If you turn the key, the pin will retract, and when you turn it the other way, it will lock the battery into position. So to install it, we open the battery up that way. We slide it onto the rail behind the saddle. The battery will lower into position. It's locked. It cannot be removed, and it's ready to go. The seat can go back into position. Now the bike is in its on position. We hit that button. There should be a little bit of power, and I'm just going to make sure that we're ready to go with that. There we go. On, test, power up, and this battery, I don't believe has any charge on it. Oh, here we go. It is charged. And there we are. So now we know everything works fine. And then the final detail, going back to removing the battery, I'm just going to turn this thing back off. We'll flip the seat forward. We'll unlock the battery. I'm going to remove it. I will show you how to put the charging cable on. In here you'll see a position that says push. The charging port will be here. Moving over to the bench, we have our battery ready. Here's our charging port. Here's our charging cable. We have 3 ports to it. That will plug in and line up to those holes. You'll have also a power cord, which you will plug into the back of your charger, and this will go to a receptacle in your home at 120 volts. I suggest doing it in that order and then hooking up to the receptacle last, just so that you don't have a surge going backwards through the battery and charger. And this concludes the entire build of your brand new Trio.